are scrolling still, so just give it another few minutes for a few more people to arrive. I'm very aware that people are coming in from all over the world, so quite important to give people an opportunity to arrive. I can see there are still people coming in from the waiting room.
Oh.
Okay, all right. So I think we have an awful lot of people here. The numbers are still rising, but I think it's important, because everybody has pressures on their time, that we get started. So I'm Felicity Gerry, Queen's Counsel at Crockett Chambers in Melbourne and Professor of Legal Practice at Deakin University. I'm delighted to welcome you to this event. Sri Lanka is in crisis and needs its friends. Australia must look beyond the boats. A reminder that this event is being recorded and also live streamed. So as I said to you a moment ago, we would love to see you if you feel safe and comfortable to put your videos on. We would be delighted to engage with you visually, but that is not a requirement. If you could keep your microphones muted and listen until you wish to ask a question, that would be helpful, so we don't have to deal with background noise. I would like to start with an acknowledgement to country. I begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, and we may well be meeting on different lands. Personally, I live on Dja Dja Wurrung country, but I'm currently in The Hague. But I think it's important to pay our respects, and I do acknowledge and pay my respects to the elders of the land on which we meet, those elders past and present. And I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. I noticed we have a little feedback there. I'm hoping that can be accommodated. Just one reminder, if it's because someone else has got their sound on, could you please mute yourselves unless you're speaking? I'd like to thank our hosts and partners for this event before we start. The Diplomatic Training Programme in Australia, the La Trobe Asia from La Trobe University, from Monash, the Gender, Peace and Security Centre, and from Sri Lanka, the Centre for Policy Alternatives. Just want to give you a little introduction about this event. What we've done is put our original flyer that I'm sure you've all seen on the screen. I will leave you to yourselves to read that flyer, but in the meantime, I just want to give you an overview of what we are trying to achieve today and in the future. This is the first in a series of events that we hope to host and partner on, with objectives of understanding the current crisis in Sri Lanka, of working towards understanding within policy, and hopefully partnering or engaging with policy, those in positions of responsibility in policy, and also hopefully to create documents and submissions that may be of assistance to those persons working in policy to help understand and make an appropriate approach to the crisis in Sri Lanka. I may well say things now that you all know, but for the purposes of summarising the way in which we seek to approach this particular event about the crisis in Sri Lanka and why Sri Lanka needs its friends, it is worth understanding the background. Sri Lanka is in deep political and economic turmoil. Its people have been plunged into poverty. There is a humanitarian and human rights crisis. This event discusses the causes of that crisis, including poor governance, corruption, and the effects of decisions by a populist and authoritarian government. Thus far, international discussion has focused on the economic and political crisis and the economic decisions of the Sri Lankan government. However, there's been less attention to the denial of human rights, the closing of space for dissent, the attacks on civil society voices, and the attacks on independent institutions, which are part of the wider crisis in governance. Unfortunately, coverage in Australia has thus far been relatively unsophisticated, with a focus on the increase in the number of people seeking to risk a sea voyage to Australia to escape the crisis, without considering the deeper issues at play. International responses to the crisis have focused on the economic demands for humanitarian assistance and financial bailouts. And perhaps the fear is that this will come with conditions that will remove social protections for the poor and affect commitments to the economic, social, and cultural rights of Sri Lankans, including, for example, access to health and access to education. So at this time of crisis, where Sri Lanka has little strength to negotiate the terms of any bailout, it's important for Sri Lanka's friends to make sure that political, humanitarian and economic responses integrate Sri Lanka's legal commitments to human rights. It must be remembered that Sri Lanka is a party to the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and other binding human rights treaties. Potential donor countries, of course, have also committed to a wide range of international human rights obligations. So the challenge is to make sure that these human rights obligations are upheld and the international law is not ignored. A failure to integrate human rights into governance and the economy is ultimately a root cause of the current crisis in Sri Lanka. So this webinar will begin a more sophisticated discussion around the nexus between the denial of rights in the Sri Lankan crisis and the connection to Australia's responsibilities. We hope to discuss why and how the economic bailout, if it occurs by the IMF or any other financial lenders, must integrate human rights frameworks into the response. We hope to discuss the role of Australia, other bilateral donors, policy makers, and so forth. We also hope to offer suggestions as to why any response, including any austerity measures that in relation to the Sri Lankan crisis, should ensure attention to protecting the economic and social rights for everyone. And the theme for today really is, what should Australia do in this regard when one is considering the importance of human rights impact assessments, public consultation, the effects of austerity measures, and of course particular impacts on women and how to ensure a gender lens on recovery and reform, as well as the impacts on migrant workers. That's a slightly longer than usual introduction to this event because I thought it was important for us all to have a framework for our discussions today. I'm now delighted to introduce our panelists. We have three eminent panelists who have great experience in this field, who can give us the benefit of their knowledge and understanding of the crisis in Sri Lanka, and also the benefit of their research and practice in their fields. We have Dr. Pakiasoti Saravanamuthy, also known as Sarah. He comes to us as founder and executive director of the Centre for Policy Alternatives in Sri Lanka. We have Dr. Samanthi Gunawanadara. She comes to us from international relations at the University of Monash. And we have my good friend, JC Welliamuna, who is a silk and currently a solicitor in Australia, former Sri Lankan High Commissioner to Australia, also known as Welly. When I speak to them, I'll give you a little bit more information about their biographies. I'm sure they can tell us about their experience. and I'm delighted to welcome them all to this very important event on the crisis in Sri Lanka, why Sri Lanka needs its friends, particularly Australia. Our first speaker is Sarah. Sarah, can you see us? Can we see you? I can see you in the top left corner of my screen. I'm sure
yes,
we will all be able to. Wonderful. I'm glad you can hear us. For those in our audience, the format is that each of our speakers will speak for about 15 minutes. I will do my best to moderate. I'm sure they've got a lot more to say than would take 15 minutes, but we have to manage it somehow. If you have questions as you go along, I will be monitoring the chat. So feel free to put your questions in the chat, and I will either come to you and ask you to put your hand up, or I will ask the question for you, or I will save your question for a Q&A session at the end. We'll try and make it a little bit interactive, but I think for the initial speaking period of each speaker, it would be good to listen and hear and have the benefit of their expertise. So over to you, Sarah. You're unfortunately only 15 minutes to tell us about the crisis in Sri Lanka from your perspective and why Sri Lanka needs its friend Australia. Thank you.
Thank you, Felicity. Well, the Sri Lankan crisis is the most dire crisis that Sri Lanka has faced in its almost 75 years of independence. I would refer to the crisis as an acute crisis of governance, which has the political dimension as well as the economic dimension. This crisis is not one of recent vintage in that it is an accumulation of bad governance since independence, which has been brought to a crescendo, if you like, by the Rajapaksas because of their lack of capacity to govern, their corruption, mismanagement, and bad decision-making. The problem is that Sri Lankan governments have treated their citizens as voters and made to them promises which they could not fulfill. As a consequence, we have got ourselves into greater and greater debt. We have a public service of 1.5 million people for a population of almost 22 million. We have subsidized everything from health, education to electricity. We have also state-owned enterprises which are making losses of millions by the day. All of this was brought to a head when former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa took over as president in November 2019. And one of the first things that he did was to cut the tax base. And as a consequence, the Treasury lost something like 600 to 800 billion rupees. In addition to that, he also decided to move towards organic fertilizer for agriculture overnight. The decision in itself was a good one, but you could not do it overnight. And as a consequence, agriculture has been devastatingly affected. And as a consequence, we also have the failure of the food crops and acute food shortage as well. The third thing that he did was he obstinately refused to go to the International Monetary Fund as the international lender of last resort, when people warned about the impending crisis gathering storm, as it were. We dipped into, not quite dipped into, we dug into our foreign exchange reserves. And as a consequence, today, we don't have any foreign exchange reserves. We paid off our international sovereign bond holders, as opposed to keeping those foreign exchange reserves to spend on imports for essential items, as a consequence of which we have a serious fuel shortage, cooking gas, drugs, and food. Transport costs have spiraled, inflation is out of control, and the exchange rate has nosedived. Now, the issue with regard to the politics is that Gotabaya Rajapaksa was essentially not a politician. He was a military man who was the Secretary of Defense under his brother Mahinda Rajapaksa when the war was won in 2009. So he had no empathy, if you like, for the concerns of the people. He had a technocratic bent of mind. And as a consequence, he isolated himself in the presidency. And he therefore gave rise to the popular demonstration against the Rajapaksas as a family and against the corruption and the looting of the treasury that had happened with Mahinda Rajapaksa, his elder brother, but had continued in his 3 years, as it were, of the presidency as well. Now, the Aragalaya, or the struggle as we called the demonstrations, are interesting because they don't have a single leadership. They're a conglomeration of various groups, some with political affiliation from the left to the right, others community groups, who all came together with one single demand. And that was that Gotabaya Rajapaksa should go home. Gotha go was the cry. In addition to that, they came out with the argument that the 225 members of parliament representing the political order, that they too were corrupt. And therefore, they should go home as well. Now, they managed to get Mahinda Rajapaksa out. They managed to get Gotabaya Rajapaksa out. And in that sense, their initial demands have succeeded, except, of course, the 225 members of parliament. Just a note on the 225. In 2019, Gotabaya Rajapaksa won the presidency by 6.9 million votes. In August 2020, at a general election, his party, the SLPP, or the Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna, won almost a 2/3 majority in parliament. Those two mandates, the argument goes, have been lost. And therefore, whilst parliament might be the legal entity and following the constitutional processes in the current context might be legal, they lack legitimacy. So there is therefore that tussle between legality and legitimacy. The Constitution says that the president can dissolve parliament 2.5 years before it fulfills its full term. So therefore, next year, February, March, the president can dissolve parliament. In the meantime, parliament can vote by a 2/3 majority to request the president to dissolve parliament. Now, both of these things are very unlikely to happen because the SLPP majority will not come back into parliament. And as far as Mr. Wickremesinghe, the current president, is concerned, he would want to see the economy showing very definite signs of coming out of the dire crisis that it is in. Mr. Wickremesinghe has been prime minister for 6 times. He has never won the presidency. He is president now because he accepted the prime ministership when Mahinda Rajapaksa resigned. Without any conditions, he accepted it. And his argument was one needed someone to take over to salvage the economy. When Gotabaya Rajapaksa was kicked out and fled the country, Ranil Wickremesinghe became president because the constitutional provisions are that when the president leaves office in midterm, the prime minister becomes president for a period of 30 days, during which parliament selects one of their own to serve out the unexpired years of that term. Ranil Wickremesinghe is in parliament in a rather odd way, insofar as at the elections in August 2020, his party was badly defeated. They did not win a seat. But the Sri Lankan electoral system provides bonus seats on the PR list to parties, and the United National Party, which is Ranil Wickremesinghe's party, was granted one seat. 10 months into parliament, they nominated Ranil Wickremesinghe to that seat. So he is president without support of his party in parliament because they only have one member in parliament. Now, the issue that faces Ranil Wickremesinghe, of course, is on the immediate economic front. The getting of the bridging finance to see us through the period before we sign up the staff level agreement with the IMF and we go to the proper debt restructuring agreement with them. We have been assisted by India, who has given us something like $4 billion US. We've been assisted by the US, by China to a certain extent, but I will come back to that, by other friendly countries to tide us over this period. However, we need a lot more. We need a lot more to get back to any sense of normalcy at this present moment. Wickremesinghe says he's focusing very much on the economy. But the arguments of the Aragalaya were of regime change, Gotha go home, get the Rajapaksas out, get them to return the money that they stole. Regime change to facilitate systemic change. That is the argument of a new constitution, the abolition of the executive presidency, where all power is concentrated in that office, in the hands of a single man or woman, and other liberal reforms to the electoral system and the system of governance. Mr. Wickremesinghe seems to be acknowledging it, but at the same time, he's not focusing on it. He has said that he will focus entirely on the economy, and the opposition parties say that they will support the government for whatever it does on the economy. On the political front, though, and this is key, they will not join government because they say the government must come out with a guideline or a timetable by which the executive presidency will be abolished, and also give a definite date for when the next general election is going to be. Neither of which Mr. Wickremesinghe seems interested in. But more to the point, on the human rights front, on the civil and political rights front, he has launched a major counterattack against the Aragalaya or the struggle. Mr. Wickremesinghe wants to identify a good Aragalaya and a bad Aragalaya. The good Aragalaya was the one that initially came out and asked for Gotha to go. It was flat. It didn't have a leadership as such. There were various groups that were involved. It was very non-sexist, non-ageist. They looked up, they, respected LGBTQI rights. There was no ethnic or religious or political differentiation or discrimination. It was almost a vision of what Sri Lanka should be like. But as it has gone on, and as it's the state has used violence against it, the more politically conscious and oriented factions of the Aragalaya have come to the fore. They are the ones who took over the presidential secretariat, the president's residence, the prime minister's residence, the prime ministerial secretariat, and they even threatened to march against parliament. But they did not really use violence. Mr. Wickremesinghe has come out against them and said that they are fascist, that they are terrorists. He's used the draconian Prevention of Terrorism Act to take in quite a few of those leaders. And what bewilders some people, indeed, including myself, is why is he doing this when in another 12 days or 15 days' time, the UN Human Rights Council will be meeting in Geneva, and there is a resolution on Sri Lanka that will be brought in this session. Surely he realizes that the Western countries who are generally perceived to be supportive of him are going to come up with serious language and condemnation of the use of this draconian act. When he was in government and prime minister within 2015 to 2019, there was a promise that there would be a moratorium on the use of the PTA. In Sri Lanka, we have many other laws that can deal with supposed violations of law and order and the public peace. We have the Public Security Ordinance, we have the ICCPR Act, we have the Penal Code, all of that. But he has chosen to use the Prevention of Terrorism Act. Now, the problem here is this, is that by doing that, he's trying to change the narrative, to say that there are people who want to take over the state. The counter-argument is that, look, Mr. Wickremesinghe wants to send out a message to the Sri Lanka People's Party supporters who made him president, that he will look after them. He will provide for their security. Some 70-odd houses of theirs have been burnt, that he will take care of them, and that he will act tough in a way that Gotabaya Rajapaksa, surprisingly, did not. Yeah. So his ability to maintain law and order compromises his position as the great reconciler who is going to bring the country together to address the economic problems that we face. What Sri Lanka needs at the moment, I would argue, is a government that is trusted by its people, who they have confidence in, who will communicate to them and take them along with them, because as the president says, and as a number of us believe, it will probably get worse before it gets better. And if it gets worse, we
listen to this webinar.
Keep going. Hopefully we can just, thank you. If you could just turn off your microphones, that would be really helpful. And I think you're pretty much to time now, Sarah. So your closing remarks, please. Thank you.
Okay. So, we need a government that will unite and reconcile the people to bring us together as a country to meet the problems into the future in terms of the economy. So what we need assistance, we need economic assistance, but I think in the international fora and bilaterally too, Sri Lanka's friends, including Australia, must firmly intimate to the government that the use of the Prevention of Terrorism Act and the clamping down on dissent must stop. Now, that's only dividing the country and making it a lot worse for a government to take us through the economic crisis into a pathway to prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm going to save up some questions for a little later because I think it's really important that we hear from our speakers. But for those of you who wish to put questions in the chat, I think it's been a fascinating experience to hear about, for example, that lack of empathy for human rights within government in Australia, and to think about that lack of empathy for human rights elsewhere, whether human rights debates are difficult in Australia, and maybe that's something we need to think about. The lack of legitimacy of government, a topic that we could discuss all day, and I'm sorry, Sarah, you only had the 15 minutes. The sort of culture of personality rather than the importance of confidence in and trust in government, and this turning of the language of politics into the language of terrorism. So some serious issues for Australia to think about arising from the Sri Lankan crisis. I'm going to collect up the chat while we have our next speaker. Again, I'm delighted to introduce Samanthi Gunawaradana from La Trobe, Asia. Samanthi, I hope I can see and hear you now. I can see you. Can you hear us and we hear you?
Yes, I'm here.
Wonderful. So I'll try and keep you to time, but I'm really interested, as I'm sure we all are, to hear the benefit of your expertise in relation to the crisis and how Australia can be that friend that we hope it is in the title of our webinar today. So a reminder for everyone, 15 minutes for each speaker. We have 3 speakers. We will have a Q&A. There's quite a lot in the chat, so you've given me some work to do, but let's listen to Samanthi's wealth of experience, particularly in relation to women and the impacts that this crisis is having on women. Over to you, Samanthi. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Felicity. I just want to start by acknowledging the people of the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung people, which is where I live and where I'm coming to you from. So I pay my respects to their elders past and present. One thing that struck me about Sarah's comments and has really struck me throughout observations of the Aragolia in particular is that we've really seen an assertion and an articulation of a different type of masculinity, and it's a non-militarized masculinity and leadership that really emerged during this period. And it's interesting, Sarah, that you noted that Ranil is actually reasserting a dominant form of militarized masculinity, if you will, through the enactment of the PTA. So I just want to make that observation and share that with you. So if I had a title for my talk, it would be something along the lines of Women's Experiences of Economic Rights in Post-War Sri Lanka, a tale told through 3 protests. I'm going to share some thoughts about the experiences of women in post-war Sri Lanka and the period leading up to the current crisis through the lens of these protests and social movements. I'll be drawing on some of my research dating back to the end of the war because I think it has relevance to what we're experiencing today. And I want to reflect on the uneven impact of economic development policy on different groups of women and question where we go to from here in providing sustainable solutions, particularly for rural women, their households and communities. And I think this is a fundamental question that must be addressed by bodies like the IMF, as well as countries such as Australia, which is interested in and invested in its bilateral relations with Sri Lanka. From an international human rights perspective, my talk is centred on the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and various international labour conventions, as well as the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. It relates to Sustainable Development Goal number 5 on gender equality, and as well as a resolution that is seldom actually discussed in Sri Lanka, and that's the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, which calls for equal participation of women in not only conflict resolution and peace negotiations, but also conflict development, post-conflict development and reconstruction. And while the UN has encouraged countries to adopt national action plans to implement 1325 measures, Sri Lanka doesn't actually have a national action plan as yet. To contextualize my remarks, it's important to know that after the war, there has been some improvements in income inequality and some indicators of poverty. Very broadly, this is uneven across the different regions, and there were geographic pockets of persistent poverty and unemployment. And threats such as the impact of climate-related droughts and floods were really beginning to materialise, particularly in the dry zone of Sri Lanka. With regards to women's experiences, post-independence, Sri Lanka made rapid gains in women's health, including maternal mortality, education and employment. And it's often been touted as one of the most or more gender equal countries in South Asia. And that's because there have been significant investors in these sectors, both from the Sri Lankan government and through various aid programs. However, there's always a however when we can't talk about gender equality, right? So women constitute about 52% of the Sri Lankan population. But if you look at things like their labour force participation rate, it's 32% in comparison to about 72% for men. Currently, there's only about 5.3% of sitting members in Parliament are women, or I haven't checked recently, but the last stat I saw was about 12 out of 225. And before the pandemic, if you look at statistics like time use surveys, you'll see that women perform, 87% of care labor or housework compared to about 60% performed by men and boys. So my key point in this talk is that the model of economic development implemented in the post-war period has undermined economic rights for many women, or at the very least has not addressed fundamental inequalities. And second, this undermining has created a crisis in social reproduction, which has worsened over the past 2 years. So social reproduction is essentially the work and institutions that go into making and maintaining daily life. This includes things like biological reproduction, but also things like cleaning, feeding people, cooking, washing clothes, looking after people's education, and so on. And to do this, we need institutions like housing, public transport, we need recreation facilities, after-school programs, hospitals, and so on. So these are everything that we need to kind of reproduce our daily lives. I agree that this is a crisis of governance, as noted by Sarah, but for me, the best way to understand this crisis as a lived experience for everyone is by looking at it as a crisis in social reproduction. And this can be very dire for women and girls, as they often carry out the burden of labour in performing these types of tasks, such as care work. But this is not new. And as we'll see, this right has been put into question, this economic right, which underscores the ability to often carry out social reproduction, has been put into question at several moments in Sri Lanka's post-war history. And this brings me to those 3 protests that I noted. So let me go through some of them and talk about briefly some of the complexities that we've observed. First of all, I'm going to take you back to 2010 in the Eastern Province in a town called Panama, where the state forcibly acquired about 1,200 acres of land to be used to develop the tourism industry. The acquired land included land that was occupied by people. They evicted about 350 families, resulting in the loss of livelihoods for people. And the idea was that they wanted to use this land to develop the tourism industry with military assistance. The issue was that most of that land was used by women for cultivation, and it was land that was often inherited or passed on by their parents through title deeds or permits and customary long time usage. This is significant because if you look at the rate of land ownership and usage in Sri Lanka, only about 16% of all privately owned land in the country belong to women. This is a fundamental source of inequality. And women use this land to cultivate various agricultural goods, and they used any surplus, they sold it, and they were able to generate an income, but they were also able to provide for their families. So food security was one of the important outcomes of this. This case has not been resolved. The second protest will go to 2011, where there was a massive demonstration in the free trade zones. This was the first time there was a zone-wide protest that occurred in these zones. This is where you see a lot of export-oriented industries, including the apparel sector, which has been significant for the Sri Lankan economy. And it was one of the sectors that really helped to maintain economic growth through the conflict. And post-war, it also provided some employment for men as well as people from the north and east. This protest was about reform to the country's pension system, which would see women not be able to access their pensions until they basically retired at 60. So women who worked in the free trade zones did access their pensions after about 5 or 6 years, which they would then use as a form of wealth to build their own house or even use as capital in their small businesses when they returned home. This was a massive protest. It was brutally repressed, but the reforms didn't go through. The third moment I would mention is at the start of 2018, the microfinance debt protests in Jaffna, which drew attention to the predatory loans that were being marketed as a key driver of women's micro-entrepreneurship and growth in the post-war context. The microfinance industry has been heavily unregulated. In fact, it hasn't really been regulated. that women were subject to interest rates of up to 220%. There were spiraling debts, and it resulted in reportedly 200 suicides of women because they just couldn't pay back the debt. And they were also subject to other forms of violence in loan collection processes. So there are other protests that I can mention. They're too numerous to mention here, but the most important thing to note is that everyone who participated in those protests participated in the current moment, and the Aragolea and the Gorta Gorgumma as well. And the current shortage of employment, food, fuel, medicines and power continue to pose grave repercussions for women and their families who've already experienced these forms of dispossession, these forms of oppression through economic models that have really put them into kind of insecure positions. What I would argue, because I think I'm running out of time.
Yeah, not too bad. You've got a couple more minutes. Keep going.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I can go into more detail about the repercussions, the gendered repercussions of the current crisis. But I think the point is this: the struggle for social reproduction is fundamentally tied to economic rights. The moment in Sri Lanka, and sadly many parts of the world today, is an undermining of economic and social rights, the right to decent work, freedom from hunger, even access to sexual and reproductive health. Women often bear the brunt of these issues. And ultimately, what it undermines is the ability to create a peaceful life. And peace, we know, is not just the absence of war. It's not just the absence of a militarized conflict or violence. Peace is the ability to live peacefully. And what do we need to live peacefully? We need food, health, education, economic, environmental security, as well as freedom from systematic and intersecting inequalities and oppressions. What we're seeing now is that the poor are forced into survival tactics, including migration overseas to work in labour conditions that are problematic and exploitative. And we need to really question these models of economic development that are coming through. What is Australia's role in all of this? Australia's role, I would say, is to help envision a regional vision of peaceful life and peaceful living that is not dependent on these ideas, the securitized borders. It's really about examining the continuum of peace and how we could actually generate these ideas in collaboration with each other in a way that's not about, I saw a comment in the chat earlier about maintaining those militarized borders. It's really about looking at the common challenges that we face in the region and working together to ensure that we can articulate a vision for economic development that embodies this spirit of peaceful living and security in the region. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Samanthi. Such a lot to think about, and so important that any crisis of governance means that we have to think about and understand the lived experience of the people in Sri Lanka. And if Australia is going to be a friend to Sri Lanka, has to be a friend to Sri Lankans people. But a big question for Australia or most countries in the world: how to have leaders with both competence and empathy. I think that comes out of what Samanthi and Sarah have said to us so far. How can we generate collaboration without being isolationist? And how can we understand our common challenges and work together for economic development that really understands it's not just about having women at the table, which is really important in itself, but also that women's issues are at the table and understood. I've made some notes about some of the questions that are being asked, but I think it's really important to hear from our third speaker before we switch to Q&A. So I'm delighted to welcome JC Welliamuna. Welly, all your work on corruption over many years internationally, I think, will be of real interest to our attendees today. I hand over to you to tell us about your experience of Sri Lanka, your experience of the crisis, but also your significant international experience in these economic and social issues that we're discussing today. JC Welliamuna, everyone. I hope you can see and hear us.
Yes, can you hear? I think
I can,
Yes,
yeah, I can hear you
yes,
loud and
thank you.
clear.
Yes, thank you, Felicity, for your introduction. And it's nice to follow my good friend Sarah and Samanthi in this very important forum. And before I share my thoughts on what international community in particular, Australia can do for Sri Lankans rather than Sri Lanka, I would like to highlight a couple of matters. One is I will briefly deal with some of the relevant basic facts that might help me to build up my arguments or to buttress my final thoughts. And secondly, I will briefly deal with a new element of corruption that is being discussed globally that might be useful for us to understand the context in which we look at Sri Lankan corruption. Well, first and foremost, I think Sarah has given a good background of what happened, what took place. I want to add some more into it. Except during the last protests, the ethno-religious tension continues in Sri Lanka. So it never disappeared, and impunity in public life continues, and state capture under Rajapaksa regime never disappeared, although they lost power in 2015, and it re-emerged, and it continued to emerge through law enforcement, through military intelligence, and so on and so forth. And on top of that, there is an unaccountable presidential system. And you need to understand that in the present crisis as well. And Sri Lanka's military budget in size is bigger than UK. A defense budget is 2.1% of GDP. And you can see why it is so. And there have been large number of emblematic cases, at least 20, abduction of journalists and so on and so forth. And none of them were resolved finally because there were more and more allegations. I think those allegations lends credence to allegations of gross abuse of human rights in Sri Lanka. And the continuous brutal crackdown of protests movement, as what we watch at the moment, will also justify the allegations that Sri Lanka cannot come out unless there is a major change in the system, cannot come out with these clutches. And it was recently reported that there were dead bodies near main protest site. I think there were 11 or 12 dead bodies, but no one expects the investigative agencies to find how it happens. But it will take time, but I'm sure it will happen one day. And how Sri Lanka is standing in international arena last 2 years is very interesting. And we know that if you can't understand a person, you look at your friends. So similarly, the voting record in UN and UN Human Rights Council places Sri Lanka in an interesting company of China, Russia, Belarus, Myanmar, Eritrea, North Korea, Venezuela, Bolivia, etc., and so on and so forth. So that is telling. To say the least, it's telling. So in that context, we need to remember that Sri Lanka has missed 3 opportunities to establish democracy in Sri Lanka. 2009, after the end of the civil war, what the government concentrated was to consolidate the family rule without giving an opportunity to re-establish democracy and rule of law. In 2015, again had an opportunity. There were a series of positive changes, positive reforms, but they could not sustain the reforms. One can argue that it was the deep state which has derailed the changes. It may be. And 2022, the potential democratic transformation was strongly possible, but you see what's going on at the moment. So if I may go into the second aspect that I want to focus on before I come into my conclusion, how I believe Australia and international community can help. Let me briefly deal with corruption from a different context. Well, everyone understands, and generally there is acceptance that the present crisis in Sri Lanka is beyond economic crisis. It's a governance crisis as well, and corruption plays a major role. And of course, corruption poses threat to any country in the world. Any country, particularly countries where the rule of law is weak, it has devastating effects. Let's look at an extension of corruption in the normal reading in global scale. There was a fascinating piece in Foreign Affairs in June 2020, which exposed intellectuals to relook at some of the ideas of what is happening globally. It's a transformation of corruption into an instrument of national strategy, which is now called strategic corruption, virtually transforming corruption into a weapon on the global stage. Now, Foreign Affairs in that particular piece has given revealing examples where, particularly, China and Russia have weaponized corruption. Countries have done it before, no doubt, but not to the scale that is seen today. We are familiar with the term grand corruption, but therefore it's important that for us to understand what the issues are, let's look at what it is. I mean, when you say grand corruption, the bribe giver and the bribe taker trying to accumulate wealth and become richer. But in strategic corruption, by contrast, the greed still there, but for some players, but the corrupt inducements are wielded against targeted country by foreigners or foreign players as part of their own country's national strategy. Now, dubious infrastructural projects that we have seen in Sri Lanka and fragile democracies, extravagant infrastructural investments like airports without flights, ports without ships, cricket stadiums without matches. Now, it really fits into this description. Furthermore, taking a principled stand in that context is very difficult for a country. It is very risky. It can prejudice economic relations, or it can create new security problems. Now, in that context, is Sri Lanka a victim of strategic corruption? In my view, yes, but it is only possible because willing political leadership will virtually be part of it, and they are beneficiaries of that system. Well, let's now, in that context, let me look at what Australians, in particular Australia or international community, can do to help Sri Lanka. Don't forget that Australia has been a great friend, and people-to-people contacts predates diplomatic relations. It started in, I think, more than a century ago, 1865. So Australia has its own problems, no doubt. It has its own challenges, tensions, but we all accept that it's a rule-based society. There is a media culture, there is a competent public service, and very hardworking people under very tough conditions as well. So this brings me to an important element that I observe in Australian foreign policy. There is almost a very close bipartisanship in formulating foreign policy. Therefore, it is possible to have a consistency and predictability. So if that is the case, openness in foreign policy is possible. In general, many countries, including Australia, have few basic values in their foreign policy vis-a-vis their national interest. At least two basic values: security and prosperity of the nation. There has been others identifying a third national interest. Of course, Dr. Gareth Evans was a proponent of this idea. That is the third element of being a good international citizen, or GIC. It's not a mere concept. It involves two benchmarks at least. Commitment to improve international law, engaging international legal systems, discharging international obligations, etc. The second element within that is participating in multilaterally to solve global problems and challenges through other multilateral agencies like UN agencies. Good international citizen is undoubtedly an important one. It is an active member of international community and may persuade others also to adhere to international legal framework. Now, Australia has given so many of those interesting examples. Now, during Bob Hawke and contemporary Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroy advocated successfully to mobilize financial sanctions against apartheid, contributed to bring down apartheid, and Hawkes particularly persuaded American and European banks to add financial sanctions to get Nelson Mandela out of prison and finally dismantling apartheid regime. And Australia, no doubt, has, as I said, on its own priorities, has its own problems, competing interests. There are other encouraging examples of other countries, such as Norway, Sweden, etc., and Scandinavian countries. They are admired for generosity of their foreign aid on one hand, and activism in protecting refugees, promoting human rights, holding bad international actors into account under international law, bilaterally and multilaterally. And Australia, and we learn that Australia has a universal jurisdiction now on genocide, crimes against humanity, gross abuses of human rights, etc. So Australia has also recently announced Magnitsky-style sanctions against corrupt elements in the world. And in that context, Australia can do a lot by becoming by displaying that Australia continues to be an active, good international citizen to protect people of Sri Lanka. Perhaps Sri Lanka is the opportunity. Thank you, Felicity. I'll wind up with that.
Thank you, Welly. Well, some interesting questions there about how Australia can be a good international citizen. The way in which sanctions can be effective, some lessons from history from Welly there, and the importance of Australia being a great friend to Sri Lanka, thinking about what it means to be a good international citizen and where we can see examples of that around the globe and what we can learn from countries like Norway and Sweden. So, time to go over to our Q&A. If you'd like to ask your question personally, do put your hand up. But what I've tried to do is moderate the discussion that has been had on the discussion boards. And I think, Sarah, for you, one thing that's really interesting here, we've had a bit of a discussion about individual identities. You know, should we have a woman in power, or is it because men are in power, and particular identities on the discussion? But when we talk about having competence as well as empathy and taking the Sri Lankan people, a leader who can take the Sri Lankan people with them and having trust and confidence in those leaders, we can hear those discussions in Australia, can't we? We've heard these discussions since, for those of us who know our Roman history, you know, through Cicero, the idea that somebody who speaks, that people will follow, and then they're a bit useless. How do we go from a culture of personality to a government that is trusted in Sri Lanka, that Australia can understand and support?
Well, with regard to the whole question of greater gender female representation in the elected bodies in Sri Lanka, I think we have to move towards electoral reform. And what I would like to see is a multi-member proportional representation system where the proportional representation list has every other candidate as a woman. That every other candidate will be a woman, and thereby you will automatically increase the number of women in parliament. Now, I take it that, you know, this notion that women have particular characteristics and men have particular characteristics, and therefore, women might be more empathetic, etc. Well, history has given us examples where that is not necessarily the case. But certainly, there will be issues that women will bring to the public agenda, which men may not or will neglect and ignore. So we do need a lot more women in parliament. And in terms of how do we get that, as I said, electoral reform is one. And the other is that the women's groups in the country must urge, persuade, pressure their sisters to get involved in politics. So a change of the system plus greater interest in participating in the national agenda.
Great, thank you. So participation makes for greater trust, Sarah tells us. Samanthi, the understanding of the lived experience and having leaders with competence and empathy, you spoke about post-conflict reconstruction. How do you see Australia's role in are we in post-conflict reconstruction in Sri Lanka? And how do you see Australia's role in, let's call it helping as a neutral word, Sri Lanka's reconstruction without paternalism?
I thought you were going to ask me, Felicity, if Australia was in post-conflict mode, and that would be
Nearly
very
did.
difficult.
Nearly did. It sounded like it, didn't it? I paused before we went off onto a completely different debate, but
No.
focusing on Sri Lanka,
Yeah.
if we can take the view that Australia must at least understand conflict and the need for conflict resolution, if we take the view that Australia does understand that, what can it do to help its friend Sri Lanka without being paternalistic?
I think the Australian approach has been to implement dialogue and development projects focused on economic development, with the understanding that economic development would lead to greater security, which would lead to less conflict, including inter-ethnic conflict in Australia. And that's a really common model of kind of peace building, where you assume that there's going to be a flow-on effect from economic development.
So just stopping you there for a moment, help people understand these models, because otherwise you get people who say, well, it's all very well, it sounds very nice, but how does this work as a question of structural governance to have these models? Because I know they exist, I know they work, I've read up on this stuff, but we might have people in our audience that think, oh, this all sounds a bit woolly. This doesn't sound like it would work. We need a government and a leader. And what is it about help us understand the structures that you're talking about?
I'm actually not sure it does work, to be honest, Felicity, because I think at a fundamental level, so one of the examples is Australia's tourism development project, which is actually an amazing investment in rebuilding tourism in east and north affected provinces. The idea is that through economic empowerment, you get greater participation, for example, of women, minorities. That economic empowerment would lead to greater political participation and so on. And so you have more people entering a political system, standing for office and so on. The other way in which often aid programs embed governance or good governance practices is through training programs, educational programs, but also through things like training people, having training programs on things like anti-corruption. Other governments like USAID, for example, invested heavily in trying to encourage women's political participation. They have these enormous programs where women are trained to kind of overcome the barriers that they face, barriers in terms of resourcing, barriers in terms of gendered attitudes, party structures, and so on. So what more can Australia do? I think that's a good question. I'm not sure if I have an answer to that. I know you're all looking at me for answers, but I think there has to be something that is a lot more collaborative, where you are listening to the voices of people at the grassroots. One of the biggest critiques that are coming from some of those movements and groups that I mentioned in my talk is that the development project has completely bypassed them altogether. There's no consultation from the government. There's no consultation from people who are giving aid, and they want to have more voice in crafting what good development looks like for them. Perhaps there's something in that as well.
Yeah, thank you. So look, we can't discover the solutions unless we consult and collaborate. I think that's what I'm drawing from what you're saying. It's really important to understand the particular circumstance in Sri Lanka. Welly, capacity building, does it work? Can Australia help? Where does corruption fit in that context?
Well, global community can help, and of course they are, in my view, under International Convention Against Corruption, is obliged to help countries to countries. For example, if you look at International Convention Against Corruption, international cooperation is one of the key elements in that. And in fact, Sri Lanka was beneficiary in increasing its capacity from 2015 onwards. But this, when one says capacity building, it's not only the investigators and the public institutions. Capacity of the people through non-governmental organizations. Capacity of people is very, very important. So if you want to make a real change, capacity building is key in any sector, in my view. Well, Australia can, and Australia has helped previously in capacity building, in human rights, in various other areas previously. I think probably that's one area that they can look at again.
Thank you. Good question in the chat for you, Sarah. How about Australia's responses to include a recommendation to repeal the PTA that can be integrated into the response to the current economic and political crisis? Should Australia actually be engaging in the way in which the PTA is being used against civil society and create, I don't know, a condition that that PTA is either abolished or not used in the way it's being used? What do you think of that question?
I think definitely Australia should align itself with all the other countries, the friends of Sri Lanka, who have come out and condemned the use of the PTA against the members of the Aragale, from the United States to the European Union to Britain. They've all come out to the United Nations itself and condemned the use of the PTA because, you know, as I said earlier, the Sri Lankan government has made a commitment to repeal and replace the Prevention of Terrorism Act with a Counter-Terror Act. And so that Counter-Terrorism Act should be consonant with Sri Lanka's international obligations and the international standards such as there exist with regard to prevention and response to terrorism. So yes, definitely, Australia should do whatever it can to persuade the Sri Lankan government to get rid of this Prevention of Terrorism Act, to not use it whilst it's on the statute books, and to move towards an international piece of legislation that reflects international standards and the country's international obligations.
Welly, you mentioned, sorry, yes, go on, Samanthi. Yes, do please.
Sorry, very minor point in response to Patrick's question there about, so in the past, human rights reform has been tied to arrangements like trade policies, the generalized system of preference, for example, that gave preferential access to markets. And they were really controversial in many respects. And I'm not sure they really worked, right? So the idea of how you can influence the state in Sri Lanka to respect human rights, I think is still a question that's open and not resolved at all.
Well, there we are. Samanthi's posed a question for us, Welly. How do we achieve that? The question that she just left us with in the end, how do we achieve respect for human rights? That could be a question for both Australia and Sri Lanka, but in the context of our discussion today, perhaps I might add to that, if you can help us to understand our international obligations on corruption. So
could I just interject?
Yep.
Yes, do.
Yeah, no, I mean, with regard to GSP Plus, of course, we lost GSP Plus precisely because of our human rights situation. Then in 2015 to 2019, we got it back. Now it is up again for renewal. And it may well be the case that the European Parliament and the Commission decide that the human rights situation has slid backwards and we might lose it again.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, Welly. So
yes, if I come to your question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Felicity. I think your question on how this corruption related matters, what can the international community do? Well, I refer to International Convention against Corruption, and if I take one fraction of it, it also deals with recovery of stolen assets. Kleptocratic regimes, they loot assets. In Sri Lanka, there are a lot of allegations, and there are some elements of truth in that. There are investigations globally conducted, and there are some emerging evidence of those matters. But once the public resources and there's corruption, the proceeds of corruptions are accumulated. They are not accumulated in Sri Lanka. It is always crossing to other countries, rich countries, and they are invested in a first world country, and the allegations that there's some money is has been dissipated, transferred to Australia as well. So now those things, the international community and those countries, the countries can help, but they can help only if the country which has lost money is requesting, because there has to be a country requesting for a requested country to respond under the international convention. But there are some countries which has their own jurisdictions to deal with corruption, even if it happens outside. Now, for example, US and Australia, in my view, is maybe possible now in a different legal scheme. And some of the countries, and particularly in US, they can deal with those instances of grand corruption or corrupt deals and bribery. Now, those corruptions can be followed through, and they may be able to first trace the looted assets, and then they seize, and then after seizing, they can go into judicial process and they seize and they can return to the country. Even if the money is not returned, the mere fact that they are seized elsewhere is a great example to show that corruption doesn't work. I mean, that is part of it. But nevertheless, if the money is looted from a country, at the end of the day, money needs to be sent back to the country where it was looted. But all for everything in that chain of events to happen, there has to be international cooperation. So that international cooperation, there is a requesting country. If Sri Lanka is not willing, still there are various other ways that it can make it possible.
Fantastic. So really thinking about how these international law frameworks can help in the way in which Australia and the international community can approach Sri Lanka. One question that you raised was around earlier on when you spoke was around universal jurisdiction. So perhaps over to Samanthi, what do we think about individual justice? If we do identify individuals, is that a key issue at the moment, or is the key issue embedding human rights into Australia's foreign policy, or a bit of both? Samanthi, are you
Yes,
able to
I'm
help
having
us
a think.
with that?
Yes, I am having.
Yeah, maybe
and
it's too big a question,
No,
but sometimes
yeah,
I'm speaking to you from The Hague, where international
Yes,
criminal
yeah.
justice is about understanding the truth of a situation, but also accountability for individuals. Is that something that we need to think about in the context of Sri Lanka? I'm not saying immediately let's have an international criminal court, but what can Australia do with mechanisms perhaps in those contexts? I'm trying not to confine the question to enable you to give us the benefit of your knowledge.
It is a really good question. I'm just reflecting on one of the comments in the chat earlier about the women and families who have been protesting non-stop almost for answers about the disappeared during the war. And that movement is not just about the war. There are also other families of the disappeared who experienced disappearances during the late 1980s and 1990s during what was known as a time of terror in the South. So there are different groups of people who have been continuously asking for individual justice for themselves, to learn what happened to their family members. And unfortunately, there's never been any form of any promise, or there may have been promises, but they haven't been followed through, particularly in kind of the latest iteration that this issue has come up. I'm not sure I can really answer the question about international jurisdictions, because that is way beyond what I do, Felicity. But I think in terms of individual accountabilities, and what we saw in the protest was a mass movement. For the first time, different communities across the country were asking for a singular vision of justice, right? And that singular vision was greater accountability, greater transparency, less corruption, and the restoration of the financial material assets that have been stripped away from the people. So I'm not sure I can really, I really don't have an answer to the question. I'm just thinking through the same
I'm not
thing.
asking you to,
Yeah.
to come up with the answer now. I think we've already said it
Yeah.
needs to be in consultation with the stakeholders and the people of Sri Lanka. But thank you for the benefit of that input, and also for us to remember the disappeared when we're having this discussion, that there are individual issues as well as global issues at play here. Welly, you mentioned earlier on, I'll come back to you in a moment, Sarah, you mentioned how sanctions were helpful in the ending of apartheid, the release of Nelson Mandela. But of course, then we also had the move towards truth and reconciliation. Do you think that's a process that we should be working towards with Sri Lanka? Is there scope for truth and reconciliation yet, or are we still at the sanctions and response stage, or a bit of both?
Well, I think there has been this debate for decades, and since the end of the war, everybody with senses realized that the conflict still continues. To resolve the conflict, one way is to have this truth commission type of an arrangement. But Sarah has worked tremendously in this field. I have also sometimes worked during that time on reconciliation. It will, but the problem is for that to happen, everyone must be genuine. Now, take for example, there has been youth uprisings in the country. In 1971, a large number of youth were disappeared and killed. Then 1980, 87 to 89, 90 period, another thousands of people disappeared. Then in the north and the east, thousands of people disappeared. Now there has never been a truth commission to look at what happened. They have, whatever they have appointed, the commissions they appointed were only to look at why people took up arms, not the conduct of the security force. There has never been in Sri Lanka, unfortunately. So they did not look at that truth commission, no opportunity, nobody came forward. Now there are so many disappearances. I'm yet to see one soldier coming out and saying, okay, this is what happened. And sorry, we didn't, it happened. Nobody came forward and apologized. Now here, of course, this greatest apology that was in 2009 period, where when the parliament, when the apology speech was made by Kevin Rudd, it was an amazing change. but unfortunately, it never happened in Sri Lanka. I think for Sri Lanka to go forward, probably that's the starting point, in my view. It's important that you have to have these institutions, but this conflict will continue until you address the root causes as well as you acknowledge where we have done mistakes. Sarah,
So Sarah, no, fantastic. Sarah, addressing the root causes and embedding a human rights strategy into Australia's aid and foreign policy. What are the answers? Do you have any?
Well, in terms of how one embeds human rights into the foreign policy of Australia, I mean, I can just say that in general, you know, the education system in any country is tremendously important, where you educate children to be citizens of a democracy. And therefore, you need to teach them about the rule of law, equality of law, human rights, so that when they come of age and get involved in public affairs, those values will be embedded in what they do. And so, I mean, I would say the same for Australia. I would certainly say the same for Sri Lanka. But the question is of a more immediate concern in terms of what can be done. So yes, Australia's membership of various multilateral and international organizations, etc. I think what needs to be done here is that Australia and all Sri Lanka's fellow members of the international community need to remind the Sri Lankan government that it has entered into certain obligations. No one has forced them. For example, the ICCPR. The ICCPR has been used in Sri Lanka not really in protection of citizens, but rather to further the interests of the government and to imprison and convict citizens. We need to remind the government of Sri Lanka, and indeed we need to remind all members of the international community that, you know, you don't cherry pick the obligations that you have entered into, and you don't cherry pick which of those obligations you are going to fulfill. So certainly, you know, Australia needs to come very strongly behind any coalition of states that is reminding the others about what their international obligations are and the importance of observing them.
Fantastic. So we're coming up to 5 minutes till the end of our session. Take a deep breath, and I'm going to ask our panelists to just come up with some final thoughts on this question of how do we look beyond the boats, or frankly, given what's been said in some of the chat today, how do we look beyond the fuel and the funding of the fuel, and how the funding of the fuel funds the sorts of human rights crises that we're seeing in Sri Lanka at the moment. That's our sub-question of our flyer. You know, Sri Lanka in crisis, it needs its friend Australia, it needs its friend Australia, must look beyond the boats. So what I'd like our panelists to do is just give us their final thoughts on the crisis, on Australia as a friend, and how we can look beyond the boats. I think I'll go to Samanthi first, please.
I just put a question in the chat, which is what's the role of soft power as well? And, you know, I work in the development and education space. And so for me, I always go to that space first to find solutions. In relation to the development space, I always think about people's interests and what community, if you want to put it in that way, are identifying as the core needs. And there was a question from Patrick in the chat as well about how can we actually harness and make sure we channel community voices and human rights concerns into Australia's aid and foreign policy. We probably already are able to do that. Australia has a vast network, not only in terms of diplomacy, but educational alumni from our Australian universities. We've got a massive diaspora as well that can connect. And I think the role of the diaspora, although in the past was often talked about in negative terms, I think there is a positive role for the diaspora in terms of connecting to community and also using that connection to influence Australia's policy through, I think we need that soft power as well as the other forms of influence that we've been talking about. I think that Sri Lankans are suffering a lot, and something has to be done to alleviate this. And I know that the diaspora in Australia are also keen to help. So I'll leave it there.
So fantastic, really many thanks for your final thoughts. Welly, really the same summing up question for you.
Sure.
Thoughts on the crisis, thoughts on Australia as a friend, and how do we look beyond the boats? Battling slightly with some sound, but keep going.
Yes, yes. I believe Australia can help stabilizing Sri Lanka's present crisis short term. That is probably important, and that is equally important. But equally important is the long-term support to governance structures, as well as to support the Sri Lankan community through bilateral and multilateral connections and multilateral international legal systems. Well, how to do it? I think open dialogue is important, and what is required is in Australia and the government of Australia to look at this Sri Lankan issue afresh, and why people are coming in by board. There may be more and more with if Sri Lanka, the Sri Lankan crisis goes further. I think it is important, therefore, that Australia look at a short-term and long-term view. Of course, it's a country where there are 159,000 diaspora here, not a small amount, and the stability for Sri Lanka would be important for Australia as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, over to Sarah. Sarah, again, same question for you. Your thoughts on the crisis, final thoughts on the crisis, Australia as a friend, and how do we think beyond the boats and fuel, I suppose?
Well, apart from the obvious one of the humanitarian assistance that Australia can give us until we get ourselves on our feet again through the IMF deals and whatever, you know, Sri Lanka is the oldest electoral democracy in Asia. We must not lose that distinctive feature of our democracy, and I think we are coming perilously close to doing that. So we have to come to a situation in which we recognize that we have a crisis of governance. We recognize that the crisis of governance can only be addressed if we integrate the human rights concerns and the concerns with regard to reconciliation into the way that we deal with the economic questions. So in that respect, as I said earlier, Australia must support in the multilateral fora the ways in which international standards and our international obligations are observed in our legislation. We can't let go of that human rights dimension because it's going to become more and more important as we have to deal and address the conditionality that will come with the IMF and the tough questions that we have to address. One other thing, we didn't touch on it, and that is, of course, the geopolitical dimension, the India-China rivalry. Now, I strongly believe that we can't get rid of that competition between India and China, and Sri Lanka has allowed itself to become a key site for that competition. But I think we should not lurch from crisis to crisis when a warship or a spy plane or whatever it is appears, everyone gets all excited. We must try to work towards establishing a system of rules-based competition between India and China and the other countries in the region so that there is a level of stability that can be introduced into this rivalry and the reduction of tensions. So maintain the human rights focus, recognize that it's all important, and combine it with a concern to join with others to ensure that there isn't any further tension in the region.
Well, what a great way to end, hearing those final thoughts from our three speakers, understanding the context of in which support is needed, the challenges for sustainability and stability, the core necessity to understand the crisis and respond with human rights as a key factor in those responses, whether they're economic, social, cultural, that to be collaborative and understanding emerges from the experts that we've heard speak to us today. Of course, it's a really challenging topic. I see that as one of the last remarks that we have in the chat today. Thank you so much to everyone for all your contributions. All of those of you who have participated will receive this recording afterwards, and our thanks particularly to our hosts and partners. The diplomatic training program, wonderful to host this for us. Thank you. Diplomacy being core to what we need to achieve here, and I know that the diplomatic training program will enable this recording to be publicly available, as it has been streamed publicly and recorded whilst we've been speaking. So thank you to everyone for attending. Thank you to our speakers. I remind you what I said at the beginning. This is the first in what we're going to try and achieve to keep this conversation going and to see how we can contribute to some movement by policymakers with a human rights perspective. I need to run now to go to court in The Hague, so I think it's a good time to say goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future with the hope that progress can be made through a human rights